So as we wrap up our coverage of the hours, I just want to focus on a few scenes. One involving Virginia Woolf, one involving Laura Brown and her son Richie, one with Richard, and one with Clarissa and Sally at the end. All right, and as I'm saying this, I'm wanting to say I'm sorry. The quality of my scans of passages from the text are getting worse all the time, and since there was not a PDF version of this rather contemporary novel available, that's why I'm just taking pictures of certain passages. So sorry about the quality of some of these scans. But I said there are just a few scenes that I want to emphasize here. And I also wanted to mention that I've put links to YouTube videos of two of these scenes that I'll refer to later on in this video, and that I think you'll like if you haven't already seen the film. And I would recommend the film, it's really good. The first scene that I'd like to discuss is when Virginia Woolf leaves her house without telling anybody and comes very close to getting on a train to London before Leonard figures out that she's gone. And he intercepts her at the train station. But on her way to the station, she begins thinking about London. And there is a real sense of exhilaration. And here on this page, and also on the next, so this is page 167 and 168, she is using language that winds up in Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway. So Cunningham is trying to capture the sense of Virginia's love of London as she is anticipating the arrival there. At the beginning of the novel, we already heard Virginia tell Leonard that she says, I think I have the first line. And the first line of the novel is one of the most famous first lines, I mean, maybe next to Jane Austen, but the first line of the novel is, Mrs. Dalloway said that she would buy the flowers herself. But also, right after that, it's as Virginia Woolf, or Mrs. Dalloway, leaves her house and she goes in this very famous walk through London, this line of what a lark, what a plunge, these are lines directly from that novel. And on the next page, she is thinking about Big Ben, the big clock tower in London. And she says, Big Ben strikes the hours which fall in leaden circles over the partygoers and omnibuses, etc. Okay, so Big Ben in Mrs. Dalloway is almost like a character. It kind of marks the time of the day throughout the novel. I mean, remember the story is the life of an ordinary woman in a single day, and we are repeatedly told when Big Ben is striking, and that the line of the leaden circles sounding in London is one that is repeated many times. A few pages later is when Leonard catches up with her at the train station. You know, this time around reading the text, I'm noticing how much more sedate the novel is compared to the film adaptation. I mean, the film really builds it up dramatically as a combination of Virginia's love for London, her frustration with doctors, and her disdain with the quiet life. So if you watch the clip from the movie, you'll see what I mean. Here in the novel, it seems very matter of fact, very sort of British, stiff upper lip. It's time for us to move back to London, don't you think? I'm not at all sure. I've been better for a long while now. We can't haunt the suburbs forever, can we? Let's discuss this over dinner, shall we? All right then. Do you want so much to live in London? I do. I wish it were otherwise. I wish I were happy with the quiet life, as do I. Oh, brother. The second scene I wanted to discuss is with Laura Brown and her son Richie after she's gone to the hotel to spend a couple hours reading her book, which is Miss Dalloway, and also contemplate whether she wants to kill herself. But anyway, this scene I wanted to use to set up the scene of Richard's suicide shortly after. Laura here is feeling kind of guilty, and you notice that she uses the word illicit here. I mean, it's almost like what she's done is almost like having an affair that is a secret from everybody. But she's also feeling like Richie is onto her somehow. He watches her constantly, almost like waking up out of her presence. Richie is presented as a very sensitive kid, completely in love with his mother, but also sensing something is not quite right with her and wanting to fix it. So I use this to lead up to Richard's death to try to emphasize the pain that he must have endured through his life as a result of being abandoned by his mother. I mean, once again, the film makes a more dramatic moment of this. And I remember when I saw the film for the first time, and I was really familiar with Mrs. Dalloway. I've been teaching it for years, but had not read The Hours yet. But when I saw the film for the first time, it showed the scene of Laura Brown picking up Richie, and right afterwards showed Richard just before Clarissa comes, and when he dies. Right, but in this scene before that happens, Richard is alone in his apartment, weeping kind of uncontrollably. And then there's a photo of Laura Brown in her wedding gown. And it was just then that I made the connection that Richie was Richard. And I think I was being a little bit slow. All the other connections between the movie and the book, I was getting, but I had not made the connection that Richie was Richard yet. But it really was a very moving scene. All right, but in the scene where Richard jumps out of the window, he does, this has been an ongoing thing in the book. He calls her Mrs. Dalloway. And also, there is this line that I have underlined here, and I also have a note in my margin in the book that refers to page 7. This line, "I don't think two people could have been happier than we've been," is a line from Virginia Woolf's own suicide note that she leaves for her husband. And so, yet another parallel, but he is deliberately, Cunningham, the author, is deliberately having Richard look at his life and his relationship with Clarissa in terms of the relationship with that person that he has had that really significant kiss early in their life with. The second film clip that I linked to the Course Connect page is the end of the movie when Laura Brown comes to Clarissa's apartment. And she is referred to then, I think it was Julia, the daughter, who refers to her as, so that's the monster. So this is the woman that is in Richard's novel that they've all, we haven't really talked about Richard's novel within the context of The Hours, but this novel is very autobiographical, and it talks a lot about Clarissa, and it also has the mother figure commit suicide at the end. And when I mentioned earlier that, trying to recapture that idea of how much pain that Richie and Richard had been through because of being abandoned by his mother, all that pent up hostility, and then writing a novel in which he characterizes the mother, right? And then so then when Clarissa and Julia and Sally are in their apartment and she comes to the door, I think it was Julia that says, "So that's the monster." I mean, this meek woman who was, I think, like 80 years old by the time that she shows up, is the one who was responsible for all that pain and suffering that Richard went through. It just seems impossible. So I attached the link to this clip on the Course Connect page because I thought you might get something from this for two reasons. One is that as getting the perspective from Laura's confession of abandoning her family. She seems really completely aware of just how bad it was for them. But that sense that she says, it was choosing life or death, that she was going to die if she stayed there. And she has to live with that. But you do get a sense of just how great her suffering had been. Even though there wasn't anything that her husband or her son did to cause it, she just had this great sense of depression and anxiety. Secondly, I think that this last part of the movie helps bring to closure something I had commented on earlier in the first video about Clarissa and Sally's relationship. I think I suggested that there didn't seem to be much of a connection. But at the end, we do get a sense that they are really grounded. But they are just maybe not all that very mushy. I mean, so Sally takes Clarissa's head in her hand. She kisses Clarissa's forehead firmly and confidently in a way that reminds Clarissa of putting a stamp on the letter. Not terribly romantic. But another thing, okay, so Clarissa squeezes Sally's shoulder. She would say, "I love you," but of course Sally knows. This made me remember one last connection that I would like to make to Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. And it's kind of comical in a way, but it has to do with Clarissa Dalloway and her husband, Richard. And they she chose him over Peter Walsh, the character we haven't really talked about much here. But she had this exhilarating kiss with Sally Seton, but she chose to marry someone who was kind of stodgy, kind of conservative, gave her space and independence, and was, so like she felt threatened by Peter Walsh because he was so in her face, and she didn't want that kind of a marriage. Well, this is the kind of marriage that Clarissa, or the relationship, I don't think they're really married, but Clarissa and Sally Seton have, is that it's safe, it's comfortable. And there's a part in this story that is another parallel to Mrs. Dalloway. After Sally has lunch with the two guys, I forget the names, she has this desire to bring Clarissa home a present, and she winds up bringing roses. And she wants to do something nice for her, and she does. And this is a direct parallel with something happens in Mrs. Dalloway, when Richard goes to a lunch and he says, and he thinks, I want to bring my wife a gift, and he decides on roses, and he says, I want to go and tell her that I love her, and he's building this up all the way till he gets home, and walking across London, And when he finally gets there, he can't bring himself to actually say the words. Not in so many words, he says, in his mind. And this is another direct parallel to Sally, who, when she brings the flowers home to Clarissa, she can't really bring herself to say the words. And then in this very last scene, it's kind of repeated that the two of them are kind of beyond having to say the words, but there is a moment here where the strength of their relationship is kind of sealed. So that's about it for this coverage of the hours. Hope you've enjoyed it. And now we reached the end of our semester.